Hello and welcome back to the Toffee Blues YouTube channel, your source for all things Everton. My name is Thomas Robertson. I'm joined today by Paul the Esk. We're going to be talking about a little bit of Everton news that's emerged in the last week or so. But before we get to that, Paul, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks. I'm looking forward to spending 45 minutes talking about 40-year-old Ashley Young signing a brand new contract extension.
New 5-year extension, yeah. But the news is, of course, the 10-point deduction. It's been everywhere in the news over the past couple of weeks. We knew that we were awaiting the outcome of the independent inquiry into our financial misdemeanors. There were plenty of rumours knocking about that it might be a 12-point deduction, it might be a few £1 million fine. It finally emerged then that it was the 10 points. We were judged to have breached the rules. So I'll just take you back to that day, Paul. When the news first emerged that it was going to be the 10-point deduction, what were your initial thoughts?
I was just incredulous, to be honest. Not in my wildest dreams did I think that the penalty would be. Well, first of all, I didn't consider it was going to be a sporting penalty. And secondly, a penalty that was over and above what would happen if you went into administration just doesn't seem to have any sense. And obviously, we'll get into that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. I always thought that we were going to be found guilty because I just didn't feel as if we could justify the degree by which we'd gone over the limit. And again, we can talk about the technicalities behind whether Everton's case was the right case or whether the Premier League actually were right in reaching the conclusions that they did. Just incredulous, but then amazed and proud of the response of all Evertonians who were just absolutely not prepared to accept this, and the speed by which Evertonians in particular started to gather themselves together and act as one. So the 1878 group and lots of other people who just working behind the scenes, quite quietly, some people without a social media presence, just doing what they can do to assist the club, to assist the fan base, to provide legal advice if needed, just to provide arguments against the stance that the Commission has taken. So whilst we've probably seen the worst of the Premier League in the last sort of few days, and the Premier League have obviously got massive problems ahead of them, we've seen the absolute best of Evertonians in terms of their response. And frankly, Sunday is going to be like something that I don't think we've ever seen before at an English football game.
Yeah, I mean, the response has been second to none, and we will get on to everything that's planned ahead of the United game this weekend. But we will start off, of course, with the rules that we've broken, because there are plenty of legal arguments that were put forwards in terms of aggravating and mitigating factors. But before we even get to that point, can you just explain to us? Well, we know that we've lost hundreds of millions of pounds. We know that we were over that, but in the end, it's come out. It was what, 19.5 million that we've exceeded the amount by. So how have we reached that? So what is the actual rule that we've broken here?
Okay, so the rule that we've broken is the rule that most people are now sadly familiar with, and that's the rule relating to what's called profitability and sustainability. And people have listened to this podcast for many years, have heard me talk about it on many occasions in the past. And that's what it is when it says that you can lose £105 million before you actually break the rules over a 3-year period. Now, it doesn't actually mean 105 million. It means that you can lose an awful lot more as long as you can justify within certain parameters why you've done that. So the normal parameters are community spending, youth spending, and spending on women's football. Now, obviously, this period included the sort of very strange COVID period where we actually joined 2 years together and averaged them out in order to make these calculations. Within that, there was a whole load of COVID-related expenses that you could put against the losses. And if you remember, I'm sure everybody does, Everton seemed to be more adversely affected by COVID than virtually any other football club. So we in the accounts that we've produced for 2020, 2021, our COVID losses were actually considerably more than anybody else, most of which was actually accepted by the Premier League. Ultimately, that wasn't particularly the issue. The issue focused on, as you said quite rightly, what the Premier League considered to be their aggravating factors, and what we considered to be our mitigation factors. And ultimately, it was either the strength of the aggregating factors or the weakness of our mitigating factors that determined the result.
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, I was certainly very confused. I'm sure I speak on behalf of quite a few people there, because we've spoken at length maybe about a year ago now, talking about the fact that since we realised financially we were in a bit of a pickle, that we'd been working alongside the Premier League and they were approving everything, every transfer that we were making, and yet somehow it still led to this point, which brings us quite nicely into the start of the aggravating factors that the Premier League brought forward. So how did we get to a point where we had to confirm every signing that we were making with the Premier League, but still managed to breach the regulations?
Well, it became pretty clear, first of all, to Everton, and secondly to the Premier League, that we were going to be in a potential breach situation. So actually, Everton initiated the conversation with the Premier League well before, I think it was August 2021, when the actual, it was the 13th of August 2021 when the actual agreement was made. But we started speaking to the Premier League long before that about the fact that we were likely to be in breach of the regulations, and what could we do in order to make sure that we weren't. And one of the things that we agreed with the Premier League, which is in a sense outside of the rule book, because there's no provision really within the Premier League rule book for this, but we agreed a strategy basically where we would go to the Premier League and say, we want to do this piece of transfer business, predominantly, obviously, people that we wanted to buy. Is that okay with you? And the Premier League initially sort of agreed that this was a sensible way of going about stuff. Subsequently, obviously, the Premier League sort of slightly changed its stance on this by saying to Everton, at the end of the day, you have to be responsible for your own decisions, and we can sort of guide you. And our guidance is particularly in the January of 2022, if you carry on spending like you are going to be in breach, and that will ultimately mean that you end up in the position that we ended up in, whereby we were charged with something. But we definitely had this period, and it sort of coincided, if you remember, with Benitez in that summer, where we spent virtually nothing. I think it was 1.7 or 1.8 million pound. And that was an attempt to get us back into line with the regulations. But obviously that wasn't successful. And I suppose, this is a double-sided coin. In order to be compliant with the regulations, one, obviously we had to reduce the amount of money that we were spending on players, both in terms of buying new players at transfer fees, but secondly, reduce the costs of our existing squad by selling a certain number of players. And within the report, it said that Marcel Brands had a plan to sell up to 8 players at a value of £80 million. Now, not only does that bring money into the club, but it reduces the amount of money that's going out. So it would have reduced wages, and it would have reduced ongoing amortization costs, all of which count when you're making the calculation for profitability and sustainability. Unfortunately, we didn't manage to sell all of those players, and the players that we did sell, we argued that we couldn't sell at the prices that we wanted. And that was down to the impact that COVID was having on the market. And there is a lot of dispute as to whether or not the impact that COVID was having on the market or not was a contributing factor, whether the Premier League was more adversely affected than any other league by virtue of it being, all big ticket players, or whether other leagues like different European leagues, which obviously had less money, were more adversely affected. So there's all sorts of nuances, and this is where both the Premier League and Everton brought in sort of industry experts, sort of expert witnesses, if you wanted to look at it in trial language, to argue the case as to the impact of COVID on the transfer window. Our case was quite clear that we couldn't sell players because the market wouldn't allow us to sell the players at the prices that we wanted or the prices that we needed. The Premier League's case was less clear, but they successfully argued at the end of the day, or the Commission rather, agreed with the point that the reason why we couldn't sell the players that we needed to sell was that there wasn't a market for the players at the prices that we wanted, which is possibly a reflection of the market conditions, but probably more a reflection of our poor recruitment before COVID hit.
Yeah, and player trading is, the fundamental method of passing profitability and sustainability rules. And the two players that popped up mainly in the inquiry are Player Y and Player X. They weren't, of course, named, but it's not going to take Sherlock Holmes to figure out who they are. Player Y being someone who we were looking to sell in 2020, but then handed him a new contract. Player X being a player who we believed we could sell for some value, but then for one reason or another, we couldn't end up selling him, and he ended up getting released on a free. But just while we're still on the aggravating factors, I don't want to go too much into the section about the extent of the breach. I don't think we really need to get into that. It's about they take into account how much over the threshold that you've gone. But in terms of misleading the Premier League about selling player Y, that was accepted. That wasn't accepted as an aggravating factor. But what was the Premier League's argument in that case?
I mean, it got particularly detailed at that point because Everton were in discussions with the Premier League. We actually provided the Premier League with a list of players, or gave them access to the sort of list of players that we targeted for sale. And Player Y initially was on that list, and then disappeared off the list. And the Premier League argued that the reason why, the Premier League argued that the reason why the Player Y had disappeared off the list was that actually we had no real intention of selling that player. Everton argued differently and said, look, the reason why that player was not on the list was that sale was being handled by the chairman, Bill Kenwright, and in order to save any confusion in terms of what the employees of the club were doing, it wasn't appropriate for him to be on that list, which is a slightly strange argument, but it also demonstrates again, and ultimately at the end of the day, with all of this, it just demonstrates not only the poor way that Everton were managed, but the very strange way in which Everton were managed, and the lack of governance that existed throughout the club at that time, and probably still exists today, whereby individuals were doing things almost on their own account. I don't mean financially on their own account, but I mean doing things themselves, sort of almost outside of the day-to-day operations of the club. And, I don't think there's an Evertonian anywhere, I'd be very surprised if there was, who doesn't accept entirely that, what's happened in all of this. They certainly will argue the nuances of the various points, but everybody accepts that Everton were badly run, and Everton ultimately were guilty of going over the limit that everybody knew that you had to operate to. And it was, I suppose at the end of the day, Mashiri took a massive gamble. He took a massive gamble in terms of trying to get the squad to a level where the squad could compete regularly in European football. He took a gamble by changing managers, much more frequently than ideally, and he did so on the basis that the managers successively were not achieving the objectives that effectively he was setting and targeting in terms of budgets, i.e. getting high enough up the league to A, earn enough money to meet our costs, and B, to get into European football, which, at the end of the day would have made the difference. Had we qualified 2 or 3 years in European football during that period, then we wouldn't have had these issues, because the revenue that we generated from European football and our ability to trade players, because those players would have been deemed as being more successful, would have got rid of all of these problems. So whilst, yes, there's a lot of justified comment and anger at the way Everton was run, it was run on the basis of Mashiri's ambitions, albeit that those ambitions were completely misguided and obviously completely, it's certainly made much greater by the fact that not only was Mashiri investing heavily in the playing squad, he was investing heavily in building a brand new stadium at the same time.
Yeah, I think
something that nobody had ever done before.
Yeah, I think you'd struggle to find another top club who tried to advance an argument that they were still trying to sell a player, but it was taken out of the hands of everyone responsible in the recruitment team, and then it was left down to one man to sort out. And of course, if we ended up in Europe, we then would have been subject to UEFA's financial rules, which would have been an entirely different ballgame altogether. So, I mean, it's never a good thing that we didn't qualify for Europe, but that maybe would have been a whole different kettle of fish. But just as you touched on towards the end there about the stadium being built, it does lead us quite nicely into our final aggravating factor about our financial breach. Had to do with stadium interest. Now, this is where it gets a lot more technical, and no matter how many times I've read it, I'm still pretty baffled by it. So could you please try and explain to us the issue here about stadium interest?
Okay. I think it's been reported by many people, and I think to a degree it's been pushed out by the club. The club has been penalised for wanting to build a new stadium. And, if that was the case, there's obviously a massive argument against that, because, investing in the club, investing in the city, as we've done so, must be viewed as a big positive. And, the Premier League has been expansionist since day one, so why be penalised for something that was clearly expansionist for Everton, driven by Mashiri's desire to have a new stadium? The point is that we weren't penalised per se for building a new stadium. We were penalised for the manner in which we tried to finance it, and and this is where the misrepresentation bit comes in, where the charge of not acting with utmost good faith comes in. The Premier League were keen to acknowledge that there was no act of dishonesty, but there was a breach of utmost good faith. And why was that? Well, I'm sure, again, most people know that Everton had affected, apart from its normal revenue, it had two sources of funding in order to build the stadium and continue to invest in the squad. One was Mashiri's money, which and he ultimately put 450 million of his own money into the club, interest-free loans, so that they didn't cost the club anything. There was a small cost at the front end in terms of all the legal charges and stuff. These type of things generate banking, the fees from the investment bankers, etc. But there was no interest payments made on that had to be made on that loan. So that was £450 million, and that just went over a period of time into Everton's main bank account. In addition, we had rights and media funding, which we've talked about on many occasions in the past. And we had a loan provided by Metro Bank, which was to do with the government's large business COVID loan scheme. Both of those loans were commercial loans, and both of those loans attracted interest. Now, that interest in normal circumstances would be chargeable under the profitability and sustainability rules. So they would be a cost, just like wages or operating costs are a cost against the club. So they actually affect the calculation at the end of the day. And the reason why the Premier League said that the commercial loans, the cost of the commercial loans, had to be attributed to the PSR, as they call it, is that within the loan agreement said that these money, so the money from rights and media funding and the money from Metro Bank, were for working capital purposes. Well, what does that mean? That means that working capital purposes means the money that's normally spent in the day-to-day running of the business. So it paid for wages, it paid for operating costs, it paid a contribution towards the transfer fees that we were incurring at the time. Nowhere in the loan agreements did it say that this money was to be used for helping build the stadium. Now, Everton turned around to the Premier League and said, well, Everton did one thing, that they took the interest charges on the commercial loans, which were for working capital purposes, and they applied those interest charges to the Everton Stadium Development Company Limited, which is the company that owns the stadium and is responsible for paying for the stadium. And they argued with the Premier League that as a result, these costs shouldn't be part of the PSR requirements. The Premier League ultimately rejected that. And they said that it was clear that the monies that Fahad Mashiri put into the club, which were interest-free, were the monies that were spent on the stadium. And one of the confusions here was that all of the monies went into one pot. It's a bit like, with your partner, if you like have a joint account, everything goes into one pot, and it's difficult to say, well, one person put this in, one person put that in, and where's that money spent? Because if it's all coming from the one pot, you don't actually know whose money it is that you're spending. And that was the point. The point of this. The other complication, without like going massively into the details, was that after Everton got planning permission, there's this thing called capitalization, and that means that you can take the costs of the stadium, and rather than those being costs that show in the profit and loss account, i.e. just increase your losses, you can spread that cost over the duration of the stadium. So a stadium is not, a building like a stadium is normally considered to have a life of 50 years. So you can spread those costs over 50 years. So it massively reduces the annual cost as against prior to that. All of those costs just appearing almost like in real time. Now, Everton could have capitalized the interest charges that they applied to Everton Stadium Development Company Limited. We decided not to do that because in doing that, it actually made it more difficult to get the long-term loan that we were trying to get to secure all of the stadium's finances. And the Premier League and the Commission accepted that Everton couldn't argue that had they done that, it would have reduced future costs because it would have been capitalized. But we then chose not to do. And they said within the Commission's findings, you can't claim credit for something, A, that you chose not to do, and B, you wouldn't do going forwards. So we argued that, well, had we done this, the impact of it would have been this, and it would have reduced our costs and brought our costs down to a level below the 105 million. And the Premier League argued against that, and the Commission rejected our argument and accepted the Premier League's argument. And ultimately, that was a big contributing factor in us being 19.5 million over the limit as calculated by the Premier League. The other big factor ultimately was our performance. We budgeted to end up 6th and we ended up 16th. And the difference between those two positions in terms of payments received from the Premier League was about 21 million. So had we finished 6th, forget the European monies for a minute, but had we finished 6th, we would have earned enough money to cover the losses that the Premier League said were in excess of what the limit was. So you can see how all of these things were tied together.
You can definitely see how they're tied together. I can't exactly see how the club managed to forecast us finishing 6th, but that's that's their issue, I guess. But
they said at the beginning of the report that the club's expectation was to finish in the top quarter of the Premier League, which actually means the top 5.
I mean, that's just remarkable. I think you'd be hard pressed to find any fan going into that season thinking that we'd be anywhere near the top 5. But maybe that's another example of the poor governance at Everton. Kind of just ridiculously high expectations. Bashiri came into the club with these lofty ambitions of getting into Europe. Obviously, those ambitions didn't seem to dwindle over the years, no matter how poorly we were performing. But yeah, really interesting that the club forecast us to finish in the top quarter, and that would have solved all of our problems. But we've discussed there the case that the Premier League advanced between the fact that we overspent despite what they say was repeated warnings. We said was cooperation. Of course, they took in to account the extent of the breach, misleading the Premier League about the stadium interest, and as we discussed, this elusive player Y, which the Commission decided was not an aggravating factor. So that brings us on to the case that Everton put forward, called mitigating factors. We brought forward 6 of them. We've already covered one there, as we discussed the stadium interest and the capitalisation of that. Well, we may as well start with player X, because we've already done player Y, so we may as well get all the elusive players out of the way. So this was something brought forward by the club, claiming that we deserve some form of credit for not pursuing a claim against player X because of a breach of contract. Without naming the player, I'm sure we can all figure out who it was. That was, of course, a player who left on a free, despite the fact that the club thought that they could generate some sort of income from him. Well, I think that's fairly up in the air whether that would have happened anyway, but the Commission refused to accept that as a mitigation. But what was the club's case in terms of player X?
Well, the club argued that with player X, we could, because that player was technically in breach of contract, we could have sued that player for the value of that contract, and we put that loss. We decided, to the club's credit, we decided not to sue the player at the time when the player was arrested but not charged, if you recall. We did that for one reason, and I think it demonstrates both the good side of Everton, but also the sort of quasi strange way that Everton runs as a business. That we said we're not going to pursue this guy. We're not going to sue this guy for the loss that we know is about to happen. And we're not going to do it because we're concerned about the guy's mental health, or psychological state was the expression that was used within the Commission. And certainly at the time of the player's arrest, his psychological state was in question. And you can see the argument that the club makes, that to then sue the guy would have just added to that, and the club took the decision that it wouldn't do that. But the club then wanted credit for that, in terms of saying, well, we didn't do this for very good reasons. i.e. his welfare, and therefore we should not necessarily have these costs attributed to the calculations. The commission didn't accept that as a mitigating point, because they said at the point when these calculations were made, at the point when it became an issue, there was no evidence as to what the player's psychological state was. So whilst there was evidence at the point where the player was arrested that his psychological state was poor, at the time when the calculation had to be made and when the decision ultimately became part of the problem, there was no evidence, or at least there was no evidence presented as to what his state was at that time. So they rejected that at a hand, and that was obviously one of the 6 mitigating factors that Everton used.
Yeah, and of course, player X obviously remained unnamed, but I think we all know it wasn't Fabian Delph, no matter what he said at the time. But the next factor that the club tried to bring forwards, which again was rejected by the commission, was of course the Ukrainian War. We all know that we had, maybe still do have, but we definitely did have long-term ties with Alisher Usmanov and USM. There was an agreement for the stadium rights. All of a sudden, I'm not sure if that money did end up being paid or didn't end up being paid, but we were certainly receiving a decent amount of income from them. Of course, they sponsored Finch Farm as well when the Ukrainian War all began, because of all the sanctions brought by the government onto any Russian assets. Of course, all that money then kind of went out the window. So that was in terms of the mitigating factors that were brought forward, in my opinion, I think it's definitely one that makes the most logical sense. But the commission decided seemingly that it was not a mitigating factor. So how did they reach that conclusion?
So at the point where Everton cut all links with USN, which was I think February 2022, when the illegal invasion of Ukraine occurred, USM had already paid Everton £114 million in sponsorship revenues, including the 30 million option for the naming rights. Interestingly, even though everything was cut in February 2022, we'd already received all of the sponsorship money for season or financial year 21-22. So it didn't actually impact 21-22. We received all that money prior to the invasion of Ukraine. But that wasn't really the argument. The argument was that USM had paid £30 million to have a naming rights package going forwards with the Bramley-Moore Stadium. And that was worth £10 million a year for 20 years. And an awful lot of that, £200 million, which was what the contract was worth, would have been paid up front. But the contract, or rather the naming rights deal, was never due to start until 2025-26, which is the first full season that Everton will play in Bramley-Moore itself. Now, Everton argued that there were negotiations taking place between Everton and USN to bring those payments forwards. So rather than it be 25-26, which is when the first payment would be received, that actually the payments would have started in the year 21-22, which would have, again, mitigated and helped Everton's position. So had the 10 million payment started in financial year 21-22, it would have obviously knocked 10 million off our losses, which would have, mitigated the situation that we were in. The Premier League and the Commission, the Premier League argued against that, and the Commission found no documentary evidence to say that we were due to get this money in that year. So Everton were arguing, look, these negotiations are taking place, they're not concluded yet, but we're confident that it would have happened and we would have received the first 10 million payment in 21-22. Therefore, you need to give us some credit for that. And the Commission rejected that on the basis that there was no evidence that the payment was about to be made. And given that we were already in February, that was effectively their argument.
Yeah, so just to summarise what we've gone through so far in terms of the Premier League's arguments, we've discussed the interest on the stadium, the capitalisation of it. We've discussed Player X, the Ukrainian War. Earlier on in the video, we discussed the fact that Marcel Brands had lined up these 8 players with a value of around or in excess of £80 million that would negate those losses, which we then allegedly lost out on because of COVID and because of the depressed market. The final couple that we have to get through are kind of based on the club's behaviour since this point. We know for a fact that in the past couple of years, it's been widely publicised, as we know in the Rafa Benitez year, we basically spent nothing. We ended up selling Richarlison for what the club kind of argued was maybe below what his actual value was. So something that the club tried to argue was this positive trend in that we were now behaving a lot better. Our finances were kind of sorting themselves out, and we can all see that over the past few years. We've spent very minimally, despite the fact whatever went on this summer in terms of the structuring of the payments for next year. But the club tried to argue that we were on a positive trend and we were cooperating with the Premier League. Now we started off the video talking about this cooperation with the Premier League, and it's the one that I've still kind of struggled to wrap my head around the most, in that we went to them in the first place and said, look, we're sailing quite close here to the limit. We're now going to come to you. We're now going to work together in terms of who we can sign and who we can't. But the Commission, for one reason or another, decided that the cooperation with the Premier League was not necessarily an important point of mitigation. So why did the Commission reach this conclusion? That, of course, they did acknowledge that we were on a positive trend, but that was not really taken as a significant factor. And then our cooperation with the Premier League, again, not a particularly exceptional argument to make. So how did the Commission reach those conclusions?
Okay, so there's 2 points there, isn't there? The Commission actually argued that, or agreed rather, that there was a limited acceptance that the positive trend should contribute towards Everton's mitigation, even though there is no such rules within the Premier League to view that. There is a rule in the EFL, the English Football League, that says if somebody's caught, in this situation, but then demonstrated afterwards to be putting things right, that should be taken as a positive consideration. That rule doesn't exist within the Premier League, but nevertheless, the Commission accepted to a limited extent. I think that was the word that they used. It diminished Everton's culpability. The reverse is true when you look at the mitigating factor that Everton claimed, i.e. its relationship with the Premier League and how cooperative we'd been with the Premier League. Whilst clearly we'd been in discussions and we provided lots and lots of information to the Premier League over the period of time, there was still concern, particularly over the interest payments issue, which we discussed in detail earlier. And as a result of that, the Commission took the view that there was nothing outstanding about Everton's willingness to cooperate that would have allowed it to become a mitigating factor. So they dismissed the idea that Everton's behaviour had been so I think the word that they used actually was exceptional, that it should be considered as a factor. So it just wasn't a factor in the end of the day. So out of the 6 contributory or the 6 mitigating factors that we put forward, we ended up with just one being there being a partial acceptance of one, which was the positive trend.
Yeah, and that brings us to the point where we discuss the nature of the sanction. We both expressed that we're slightly dumbfounded by the fact that we've ended up with this 10-point penalty, a penalty higher than if a club goes into administration, and something that's I can't really wrap my head around. The fact is that the Premier League, of course, when we were discussing the positive trend argument, and that the fact that in the EFL there is something in place where you can kind of claim better behaviour can influence the decision, but the Premier League wanted to reject that because there is no such rule in the Premier League. It is only in the EFL, but then relied on the decision of Sheffield Wednesday's points deduction in terms of deciding on the penalty that should be given to us. Everton tried to claim that there should be a financial penalty, then if not that, then a transfer ban. But the commission obviously then decided to conclude that a 10-point deduction is the only fair sanction because it's a sporting sanction. I think you'd struggle to find anyone who can argue that we managed to gain any sort of sporting benefit from the fact that from this overspend. If you look at how we performed in the league over the past couple of years, but what were your thoughts on the fact that the commission decided not to go for a financial penalty? They decided not to go for a transfer ban. Who knows? That might be overturned based on the appeal. I have no idea what the likelihood is of that. I think we are finding out before this weekend. But they decided to land on this penalty more severe than a club going into administration.
Yeah, and to be honest, I think this is where Everton's focus has to be going forwards. I think we have to accept, our culpability in terms of we're guilty, pretty much as charged. But is the penalty, is the sanction that's been applied by the commission the appropriate and correct sanction? And if you look at the logic applied by the commission for this, then it falls down under any form of scrutiny. First of all, they use the Sheffield Wednesday versus the English Football League as a precedent for sporting sanction, and they say that the sporting sanction is appropriate because there was a sporting advantage was gained by Everton, as was the case with Sheffield Wednesday. But yet elsewhere within the report, it says that the sporting advantage created by Everton is unquantifiable. So if it's unquantifiable, by definition, what is the sporting advantage? If you can't actually put your finger on it and put a number on it or demonstrate what it was, how can it be a contributing factor? So I think that's a point that we need to make. And then secondly, and I suppose more controversially, this idea that because Farhad Moshiri was a very wealthy individual, a financial penalty, only a financial penalty, was not the right penalty for Everton Football Club. There's so much case history throughout football, European football in particular, but also in English football, whereby financial penalties have been applied for breaking rules. And the idea that just because Moshiri was a very wealthy person, he didn't help himself by appearing at the commission and admitting by anybody's standards he was a very wealthy individual, which seems like a bit an odd thing to say. But notwithstanding that, the idea that just because he is very wealthy, some form of financial penalty is not a penalty, just doesn't stand up. It doesn't stand up on the basis of precedent. And I think this is where, to repeat myself, and this is the point going forward, that when it comes to the appeal, and the appeal is going to be heard in a very short period of time, that's exactly what we focus upon. That the penalty itself is just not appropriate. It's way too high. It shouldn't be a sporting penalty in the first sporting sanction in the first place. And secondly, even if it was, 10 points is just ridiculous based on, the fact that what's the worst thing that a club can do is to go into administration and leave its creditors, some of whom would be football creditors, in a position where they may not get paid or they won't get paid fully. That's the worst thing a business can do. Yet that's only worth 9 points. Yet a technical breach of the spending rules to the tune of £19.5 million is worth 10 points. It just doesn't add up. There's no proportionality to this. And I think, and I've spoken to several barristers since, and there are people working on this now, but this is the point by which the appeal will find in favour of Everton Football Club.
Well, that's some slightly positive news there. And just to kind of wrap us up here, let's talk about the fantastic response that we've seen over the last week. Of course, there was this massive fundraiser that went up. The 1878 group have now organised several banners. I believe a plane's been organised as well. There's now there's a motion in Parliament to discuss it. I mean, there's been a massive reaction to it. Some, I'd say, to a pretty solid extent, solidarity from other Premier League fans. Of course, you'll always have some wind-up merchants on Twitter. But Paul, just to conclude, because I mean, all of this has been a bit grim to talk about. Just a word on the absolutely fantastic response that we've seen since.
Well, as we started the podcast, the response of Evertonians has been nothing but magnificent, both in terms of contributing, money, and money is obviously tight at this particular moment in time. Certainly at this time of the year when people are preparing for Christmas, to contribute in the manner in which they have is amazing. The coordination, getting all of the the Reds Premier League corrupt leaflets available for everybody that's going to be inside the ground on Sunday, the banners, the ability to communicate with the press, get the message across to the media that this is not acceptable, has been fantastic. But also, very interestingly, there's a wide acknowledgement across football that the Premier League are acting disproportionately here because of the threat. Well, it's no longer a threat, it's going to happen because of independent regulation. And in doing what they've done and the manner in which they've done it, they've actually reduced their case for them being proper regulators of football, because they've acted so improperly in this case. And there are many football clubs and the fans of many football clubs who are looking at their own particular set of circumstances, not all of whom are like the smaller clubs, the Nottingham Forest, the Wolves, for example, of this world, but Manchester City, Manchester United, and Chelsea, just as three examples. And actually considering that if the same standards were applied to their cases, it's going to be really damaging to their clubs. Now, that's not to say that those clubs shouldn't escape punishment, in the same way that it's not to say that Everton shouldn't escape punishment, because clearly there needs to be punishment in order to act as a means of stopping other clubs from doing the same in the future. But the response of Evertonians in particular, but football fans generally, is that the Premier League are effectively out of control, and they're not only has Everton proved themselves to be poor custodians of Everton Football Club, as a result we're in this position, but the Premier League are now proving themselves to be poor custodians of of the highest level of English football. And this is a situation that's going to come back to bite them. They are going to be proven as not fit to run the game themselves. And this just strengthens the case for independent regulation, and they only have themselves to blame. They are potentially killing the goose that laid the golden egg.
Yeah, I, for one, cannot wait to see the response on Sunday. I can't wait to see how Sky Sports try and deal with that as well. I mean, there's been talk of putting through fake crowd noise to avoid the audio from the ground. We will have to see how that develops. But Paul, as always, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you all very much for listening. Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comments down below, and join us next time on the Toffee Blues.